How's the volume? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Sam and Cornelia, for the wonderful tours today. Just because I'm sure you're all curious with the mention of songs. My wife is Susie Q. My daughters are Layla and Cecilia, and my studio is Red House. So it's good Jimmy song. There's a lot of reasons why it's called Red House, but we'll just go with the Jimmy thing for right now. But yeah, our studio. So my studio, Red House, is based in Cleveland, Ohio, and we really try to focus in on regenerative architecture. And that's the type of architecture that actually leaves the world better the more you build. And I think that's the type of architecture we should all be striving for. There's a lot of focus on sustainability, but as we were touring and talking today, sustainably destroying the planet isn't really working out for us. So now I think we should put our efforts to, as we build, we should actually try to leave the world a better place. And mycotexture is one of the ways I believe we can do that. It's just, I don't have to go through and explain mycelium to everyone, so that's, I'm going to skip about 5 slides to go directly into what you can do with that mycelium. Here you see on the left mycelium that gets paired with any kind of plant base, basically a substrate that would grow on. And does anybody cultivate mushrooms in the room? Few cultivators. Okay, so yeah, what you see next is kind of what you're doing there. You got your mushrooms that are growing, those are reishi mushrooms, and then you have what's left over, which is that spent mushroom substrate, which is the mixture of that biomass from the plant substrate and the mycelium that's binding that together. It's kind of weaving it together in a way that becomes a solid composite. What we can do there is, we can harvest the mushrooms. And what do you all do with your substrates? Anyone want to shout out what they do with it? Compost. That's one of the best things you can do with it. So yeah, a lot of folks, if they end up having too much, they'll just kind of throw it into the woods, and we'll return to nature there. That's great. If you have the time and the opportunity to mix it with some NPK and mix it with other things, you can get some really nice compost from that and use that in gardens and things like that. We found another alternative to that, and that's if you take that spent mushroom substrate, and this is exactly what this brick is made from. If you compact that and heat that, then you get a material that's very similar to wood. So I'm going to go ahead and pass that around. Okay, so we were just starting with the mycotexture and basically defining that. So we're talking about building or shaping the built environment using fungi. And we gave one way, we're passing around the brick now, so you see what we can do with the spent mushroom substrate. The mycotexture industry is mostly focused on, I think, packaging materials is kind of the biggest one, and then leather goods is another one. In the top left, you probably are all familiar with Ecovative, and they've developed technology for making packaging materials, and they're licensing that technology to companies like Loop that you see there that's making coffins, Biome on the bottom left that's making insulation materials, and then there are other companies like Bolt Threads and MycoWorks that are creating leather goods. And you see them working with such folks as Adidas, Cadillac, and Hermes, creating some very bespoke and beautiful vegan leather alternatives. And so this is non-petrochemicals, non-animal based leather goods. Okay, so we're talking about the different things that we're probably most familiar with, but architecture is probably something that might be new to some of you all. Here's what we normally point to when we talk about the genesis of mycotexture. And on the left is a project that was done by Phil Ross, who went on to found MycoWorks. It's called the Tea House, and what he had done here was to take these living blocks of reishi and then stack them into an arch structure that was in a gallery in Dusseldorf. And so it not only had the ability to form space to create what they call the tea house, but the living reishi was able to be harvested right there and create tea, and you could actually drink the fruit of the fruiting bodies that were there in the gallery. On the right, what you see is called the Hi-Fi Project, and this was a project done by David Benjamin that used bricks that were made by Ecovative, very similar to the packaging material, where they stacked them up and had a wooden frame underneath there to create a temporary installation at MoMA in New York City in 2014. And this was up for a short period of time in New York City and exposed to the weather there. But these are both very temporary structures, just kind of hinting at what could be done using fungi to shape the built environment. I want to point to a project that we did in Namibia that I would consider the first, full-scale habitable structure that was made using fungal mycelium. So this used that spent mushroom substrate material to actually make the blocks that were the bearing walls of this project. It's a project we called MycoHab, and we worked on this for a number of years with researchers at MIT at the Center for Bits and Atoms, and it was funded by Standard Bank Group in South Africa. And they picked Windhoek, Namibia as the place to demonstrate this project because there's a huge problem there with an encroaching species of bush. There's problems with food security, and there's problems with housing security. And the project we developed addressed all three at the same time. What we did is we took the waste from the encroacher bush, which you see here on the far left. It's a species called Acacia mellifera, which is a blackthorn bush. Pretty gnarly, as you can see there. And what they needed to do was find a marketable outlet for this material. They went to industry and they said, what can we do with this? And industry basically came back and said it's not good for anything except for burning it. So they were able to, turn it into fuel pellets, or it could become charcoal, maybe biochar if you worked really hard at it. But it was really only good for burning as far as they were concerned. But we talked to some other researchers that found that it actually works as a substrate for growing oyster mushrooms. And so we developed a process where that was used to make oyster mushrooms. Those mushrooms went to market to feed people. And then we took the waste material from that and we put it into this brick press that you see there in the blue. And it was compacted into these large blocks you see there. So the one that's going around is pretty small compared to this. These were about a cubic foot. So pretty hefty objects, and they were basically the strength of a concrete block. So this is just waste material. It came from the farming, and I want to be very clear about this. Inevitably, when we explain this to reporters, they'll say, this guy built a house out of mushrooms. I promise you that's not the case. The mushrooms went to feed people. We believe food is food, and food is sacred. It was the waste material from making that, growing those mushrooms that went into making the house. And thereby we were diverting this waste material, turning it into carbon storing materials. And this is how we believe it's regenerative, because we took this waste resource that was causing desertification, we used that to create food and housing, and then the blocks that were made at the end of the day actually stored carbon dioxide because they were taking this biogenic mass, and instead of burning it, releasing that CO2 into the environment, it's locking it away for the life of the building. So I mentioned briefly that the fact that they had this encroacher bush, which you see there on the left is what Namibia used to look like and should look like before the bush encroachment became a problem, and that's mostly due to another invasive species, which is called Germans. And as Cornelia mentioned, I am German, so I guess I could make that joke. Around the turn of the 19th, going into the 19th century, German settlers came there and started putting up fences, killing animals, changing wildlife management practices so that they could grow cattle on the land instead of the indigenous practices, which was sustainably creating, the grasslands you see there on the left. This bush is now grown out of control, and it's creating desertification because the bush is absorbing so much of the natural water supply there, the aquifers, and creating it. So it's basically the wildlife management is completely different than what it used to be. So now seeing this as a major problem, again, the government of Namibia are looking at these 45 million hectares of land, about 60% of the whole country of Namibia that needs to be done with this, and saying, what can we do with these 30 million tons of biomass that are created basically every year that needs to sustainably be harvested and used somehow, rather than just be burned at field, which is what a lot of the farmers are doing right now. So this creates an opportunity for us to make these blocks, and a little bit about them. So this one very small project that you see there is basically a bedroom and a bathroom. It's like a really small hotel room or an eco lodge that you can imagine having somewhere, but also a very small house for folks experiencing housing insecurity. And Namibia could be settled into these humanitarian houses. It took 12 tons of that encroacher bush, paired that with some mycelium, some water, and created 3 tons of food, again, which went to feed people. And then the resulting spent mushroom substrate, or the mycelium binding together that bush, was turned into 925 blocks, which stored about 12 tons of carbon dioxide. So it was about 12 tons of material actually equal 12 tons of carbon dioxide that was stored in here. And I'll talk a little bit about that carbon accounting without going too much into it. But actually, every block that we made stored about 1.5 times its own weight in CO2. And that sounds, nearly impossible. How could you get more air into that than actually it weighs? It's because the CO2 molecule, as it's in the air, is much heavier than the organic carbon that the plant draws down during its life cycle and stores into the plant material that then goes on to be stored in here. So if you look at that CO2 over C, it's about 3.5 times the weight of that material. And then when you multiply that out with 40% of the biomass of the block being organic carbon, you get about 1.5 times its own weight in carbon. So what we did from that is subtract all of the manufacturing processes, the cultivation processes, the fact that the mushrooms are being digested by people, and we're digesting them and we're breathing them and turning that, unless we're completely turning it into our own biomass, which would be dangerous. We're mostly respiring that carbon back into the environment. So we don't count any of the mushrooms. It's really just the spent mushroom substrate that gets locked into building material and isn't burned and doesn't release that carbon dioxide into the environment. It ends up being about 1-to-1. Every ton of material we make, we store a ton of carbon dioxide. The strength of materials, the density and everything's up there. Again, it's roughly about the size of a concrete block, the weight of a concrete block, and the strength of a concrete block. So we got about 6 megapascals in compressive strength there. Here, some of the blocks that we make in Cleveland actually go up to 26 megapascals, and to put that into American units, into freedom units, if you will, that's about 3,500 PSI, which is about the strength of a concrete foundation, reinforced concrete, very, very strong material. So it's similar to wood, similar to concrete, and can be used. That strength of material could actually be going into high-rise construction. What we did in Namibia is great for 1-story buildings, but 26 megapascals is actually enough to build high-rises with. And just in case none of those units make sense to you, PSI or MPa, we have a much less scientific way, but a much more fun way of demonstrating the strength of the material. And this is my friend Pendapalo, who's very capable with a sledgehammer demonstrating concrete block on the left and a mico block on the right. And so you can see, the concrete block really didn't stand a chance there. Yeah, go Mico, right? We got, there's sometimes there'll be like somebody from the concrete industry in the audience, or a concrete apologist, and they'll say it's not fair because that was hollow and yours is solid. And so we did the test again with solid materials. Same thing. Basically, the concrete shatters because it's a brittle material. The mico block is much like wood, which is very ductile, and it can resist an impact, which is hugely important if there's a psychopath with a sledgehammer that's trying to get into your building. It's demonstrated by Pendapalo, but what it's really kind of alluding to is what happens in seismic events when you have buildings that are pounding up against each other and knocking each other. They make that impact to each other. Concrete is famously, brittle and heavy, which are the worst things you can have in those seismic events, and that's why people that build with concrete, the parts of the world that do that, it's catastrophic when there's seismic events in Haiti and Africa when these things happen. If you have a more ductile material, we build with a lot of wood here. It's a ductile material that seismic events aren't as dangerous, and the mico block is very similar in that regard. So I mentioned regeneration, and I just want to kind of labor that just a little bit. We mentioned that we could store a ton of carbon dioxide for every ton of material we make. We've put that in perspective. Concrete emits a ton of carbon dioxide for every ton that's made by the concrete industry. Steel emits close to 2 tons for every ton that's made of that material. So it's not only that we're storing carbon dioxide and we're mitigating greenhouse gases when we build this, but we're replacing the types of materials that do emit that. And so, we would say it's sustainable if it, didn't emit any carbon dioxide. If we were replacing these materials like concrete and steel, that, I consider that sustainable. Once we go that extra mile and we say we're actually storing carbon dioxide, and the more we build, the less greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere, then you start to get to a point where we're calling it regeneration. The other thing that we're talking about here is the land impact. By taking that encroacher bush and thinning that and creating it more to what ecologists and environmentalists want for the region, that looks at sustainably fighting desertification and creating those grasslands that are advantageous to not only natural wildlife, but cattle farming and all kinds of other operations, including the growing of grass, which absorbs a lot more carbon dioxide than the bush would. Then you have basically 0.1 hectares of land regenerated for every ton of material. And again, this was a 12-ton building, so we regenerated more than a hectare for that very, very small building you see there. Water use, way down. End of life, this is a compostable material. It's the same as the materials we just said were all composting. It's just heated and compacted. There's no added materials to this. It's still a compostable material. It'll take a much longer to break down because it's now compacted, and it takes a lot longer to loosen up and then go back to the earth, but it's a compostable material, much like wood is. We build with wood all the time. It's a compostable material until you start putting in pressure-treated chemicals like copper chromated arsenic and different things that are actually poisoning that before you put it into the building, and then it goes back to the environment. So this has none of that. It has none of the formaldehyde glues that we see in a lot of wood products. This actually, guess what the glue is? Anybody want to guess what it is? Mycelium. It's fungus. Yes. So great topic for this crowd. So that's where we talk about this being a net regenerative effect. And we had some really great tours today, and we looked at a very sustainable building, and he kind of was throwing out the word regenerative, and I was like, what do you mean by regenerative? Isn't that more sustainable rather than regenerative? Because what we're looking at here is actually leaving the planet better the more we build. The more we build, we could actually build our way out of a climate crisis by storing carbon dioxide, by regenerating land. This has the opportunity, if we were to replace a lot of these high embodied carbon materials with it, we could actually build our way out of the climate crisis and mitigate greenhouse gases. I see some questions already.
Are you okay with question introduction?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
I just want to make sure the water use is including all the water, like to grow the mushrooms. I'm just trying to.
It is including the water to grow the mushrooms, but I'm not including that as the benefit. So this is just looking in terms of building materials. If we consider the fact that we're now making 3 tons of mushrooms, and we consider the protein that comes from that's going to offset vegetables, which require 10 times the amount of water that mushrooms do, or cattle, which requires 100 times the amount of water to create the same amount of material, it gets way bigger than that. So we didn't even include that. Now, this is normally for an architectural audience, so just talking about the materials. But I need to redo this slide and really talk about that, because there's a much better footprint when it comes to water when we factor those things in, offsetting the need for other sources of protein or other sources of food. So yeah, very good question. And I'm going to kind of put a finer point on that. So we talked about this being regenerative. Buildings are responsible for 40% of the world's carbon emissions. Agriculture is responsible for about 20%. So taken together, architecture and agriculture are responsible for over half of all of the carbon emissions on the planet. And mycotexture makes food and housing with a net carbon storage. So this is why we say, the more we do this, the more we could actually, build our way out of the climate crisis. We're just, everything I've told you so far is really just talking about architecture. It's about building. We haven't factored in the food part of this. The fact that we're creating food and materials and storing carbon dioxide at the same time, that has a huge benefit for global emissions. And this is something we want to look into further. We're talking to people that are expert in life cycle analysis and writing these carbon accounting. I'm a terrible accountant. Everything I do is very back of envelope, but it's double checked by The people that know what they're talking about, but we're starting to publish some papers that are talking about the real carbon accounting of this, and you can see by taking something that's normally responsible for 60% of all greenhouse gases and turning that into a carbon sink rather than carbon emissions, we're talking about a huge change. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit. So if anybody wants to interrupt with questions, but if not, I'm going to move on to a project called Biocycler.
So Chris, there is someone that wants to
Yep.
know if the Red House is hiring. Yeah, online.
The last slide has my email, so yeah, please reach out to me. Right now I have 20 interns coming this summer, and it's going to be like herding cats for me. So it's not a great time to ask, but if you want to help me herd cats, I could probably help with that. There's a question in front row.
So you mentioned how like it would react like to an earthquake or something like that.
Yep.
How does it react like to a flood?
We probably also need you to repeat.
I'll repeat the question, yeah. So the question was reacting to flood. So basically we would detail this the same way the wood construction would be. And so we're looking at weatherproofing it at all opportunities. And if it becomes flooded for a short amount of time, gets wet, and then the water subsides and it's able to breathe that back into the environment, very similar to wood. If you can dry it out, it will go back to being, as structural as it was before. If you have a scenario where it's getting wet and dry and wet and dry and wet and dry, that's a big problem, similar to wood construction. So we try to avoid those scenarios, and that has to do with the architectural detailing, but the material performs just like wood would.
Would it not work in rain weather then?
It does work. So again, it works on rainy weather. I live in a house that's over 100 years old that's made out of wood, 2x4s, that type of construction. It's done all the time as long as you have weatherproofing to it, siding on your house. That's how an architect's going to detail that. And we always point to trusses in Europe that are hundreds of years old. There are timbers inside of some of the pyramids in Egypt that are thousands of years old. As long as it's protected from the environment and protected from the elements and rain and things like that, it will last forever. But yeah, that's up to the architect to detail it. The project we did in Namibia, I'll go back to that real quick, and you can see we left the blocks exposed there in the front of the building where it's nice overhang there, so it's got a nice hat. The rain's gonna get on that every once in a while, but it's going to dry out, and it's a very dry environment there. So we felt comfortable exposing it to the elements just in that one case, but the rest of the building is covered in a mud plaster, so it's just mud mixed with a little bit of lime. And that is also hygroscopic. It'll let the water come in and out, but it'll protect it. So here in Georgia and Ohio, even in Alaska, what I would do is I'd put a breathable membrane on it, furring strips, and some sort of siding. So that could be anything like wood siding, cedar shakes, nice biogenic materials, or very commonly used things like fiber cement board, metal siding. Those types of things are used as siding materials that would cover something like a wood structure. One more, yes.
So I don't know if I missed it, but you said that like the glue is mycelium.
Yes.
Do you mean like when you're putting it together too?
Well, yeah, so the glue, the question was I mentioned before the mycelium is the glue that holds that together. So I was talking, basically alluding to plywoods and oriented strand boards and, the faux woods that usually use synthetic glues that hold together fibers. That is the type of glue that makes the material in mycohab. The mycelium is what's holding together those small constituents. But what we used for glue to hold each of those blocks together, is mostly gravity. But there was a little bit of wood glue that was used in between each one of those blocks. So instead of having a mortar or things like that, they were glued together that way. Yeah, we're looking for more sustainable ways of doing that, but there are, biodegradable wood glues that, can be used for such a process. You'll see in, further projects that are coming up, we're looking to make it so that they're slabs of material and you don't even need the glue because you just have whole walls that are made out of units. Okay.
Two more audience questions.
Two more audience, okay.
Scott?
I was going to ask you, are there any particular mushrooms that are being mass produced that produce a waterproofing chemical, or just to give you like corn. They're making lots of, oil products and stuff, and corn oils and so on, and a lot of it can be organic.
Yes.
So I was wondering, when you were talking about the problem of waterproofing,
Yep.
would there be already a mushroom out there that could be mass produced, and to do that, and keep it sort of in the mushroom,
Yeah.
family more or less?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So, question. I don't know if the audience, virtual audience, could hear that. The question was: is there maybe a species of fungi that could create that waterproofing agent to the materials? And I think there is. I don't know that we've found it. We've done a lot of experiments with getting the skins very thick, the mycelial skins on that. And we're testing that for hydrophobicity and things like that. But you framed it as a problem, and I want to push back on that a little bit, because I don't think it's a problem, because what we want are biodegradable materials at the end of the day. The same way that the wood 2x4s that are in my house are biodegradable. I kind of like that. Because if I design a building correctly and I have a biodegradable structure and with a skin that's very hydrophobic, let's say I use steel, corrugated metal or something like that for my steel or for my siding, then I can take that and I can recycle that metal, and then I have a biodegradable building that's ideally is my structure, my insulation, my fire resistance, everything is not mixed with these toxic chemicals the way that a lot of wood products are. It's not mixed with fiberglass insulation. It's not mixed with all of these other things. So when I tear that down, I can just literally grind that up and put that back to the earth and compost it. So the way I think we look at building is a little more holistic, where that material can either be recycled, which leads me to the next project, or it could be composted, which would be an ideal scenario as well.
So John had a question.
Okay, yeah.
So the foundation of the building, is that like concrete?
That is concrete, yeah. So it's concrete foundation, so, we don't advise this for anything subsurface, so we're using concrete. My preference would have been, stone, natural material that could have been used for that, but we're, a team on this and working with engineers, and sometimes they get to, pull their rank, and so, it's a concrete foundation for that. So it's if there's anybody from the concrete lobby in the audience, we're not replacing concrete for substructure. We're just looking at replacing superstructure, which my next slide will show, the reason why I think, we're probably going to need both. Okay, one question. Yeah.
What kind of timelines do you have for building these structures compared to using like wood or steel and metal?
Yeah, so it's a very similar building process. You'll see is, we go on, there's going to be quicker methods for doing it if we get to the slab technologies that I'm going to mention soon. So that, timeline on this is similar to building with any material. This would be similar to concrete block, right? Because we were talking about, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Talking about setting blocks up in masonry. As far as making the materials, that's a good question. Usually we describe it as 30 plus 1 days. So the 30 part of that is the agricultural process. We take the bush and we put it through our fruiting cycle, grow the mycelium, put it through the fruiting cycle, and then we have our crop within 30 days, which is a very, fast process to get a food, right? Sometimes it takes all year, all season to get your vegetables grown. Mushrooms grow very quickly, as everyone in this room knows. So that's a very fast process to get to food. From there, the manufacturer takes the byproduct from that and goes directly into making the material. So it's just as quick as using any kind of waste wood fiber, but this actually has the glue embedded in it. So it's similar timeline for agriculture, similar timeline for manufacturing, similar timeline for building. And much faster, by the way, to make the material. So if we're using fungi to make our materials rather than waiting for trees to grow or waiting for even bamboo or fast-growing plants to grow, we're kind of tipping the scale. And that becomes important from a third project I'll talk about tonight. Maybe I should have laid this out first. We're going to be talking about 3 projects. First we were in Africa. Now I'm bringing you back to my hometown of Cleveland, Ohio for the Biocycler. And then the last project we're going to talk about, we're actually going off planet. We're doing some work with NASA. And, if we have time to talk about it, we'll take you to the moon. So this next one is Biocycler, and I mentioned it has a genesis in Cleveland, Ohio. We have a lot of crumbling infrastructure there. on the left is, something that wouldn't be uncommon to see in one of our neighborhoods, a house that's ready for demolition. It's been disinvested and left abandoned and condemned, and frankly very dangerous. One of the things that makes it even more dangerous than the fact that it could fall down is somebody lived in that house recently, and it has lots of paint that's peeling and creating lead-based paint dust in the atmosphere. Children get exposed to that. Their toys roll through the dust, and they put the toys in their mouth, and they are poisoned by the lead. So there's not only is crumbling infrastructure bad to look at, but it's actually dangerous for our children. Lead poisoning, causes all kinds of developmental delays. And a recent study in 2015 showed that about half the planet, the children are poisoned by lead, and it's led to an average of a decrease of IQ of about 3 points per person in the entire planet. That sounds, terrible, obviously, because that's half the planet. But if they would have done that study in the 1980s when I was growing up, they would have found that it's closer to 100% of us that were, basically exposed to these poisons and had, an IQ loss of nearly 6 points on average. So imagine where we'd all be Mensa if it weren't for the, petro industry putting lead into gasoline, which got phased out, before and around the 1980s, and lead-based paint that was in paint until 1979. So any building made before 1979 has the possibility of having this paint within it. Add to that, the world will be doubling its footprint by 2060. That's like adding a New York City every month for the next 40 years. And with the current building processes, we'll never get to carbon neutrality. Mentioned earlier that 40% of the world's greenhouse gases come from this building. To be able to continue to build the way that we're doing to meet the housing needs by 2060 is unsustainable. It's unattainable, basically. There is about 600 million tons of construction and demolition waste that go to landfills each year. And you add to that, that's just conventional building practices. So that's, during construction, there's a lot of waste that goes to landfill. During demolition, as you see there, a lot of that material goes to landfill. You add to that things like natural disasters that not only have the debris from buildings going to landfill, but a lot of trees and other plant life that is being cleared and sent away. Hurricane Katrina alone was 72 million tons of debris, and add to that war. This recent war in Gaza, only a couple of years now, 42 million tons of debris created in the bombing of Gaza. Very small location, a lot of damage, a lot of debris, a lot of tons of debris made in that. So you add all of these things together, there is a lot of material that's going to landfill. It's poisoning the environment as it does so, and it's creating greenhouse gases as it does so. So I'm going to play a short video. I don't know if this is going to be loud enough for you guys, but hopefully it'll go through them. Is that playing? You can hear it? It's me.
I built a process that can be flex for the basic motion to create the house while generating a single part. Called microtension. We can change how we do it. Here in Cleveland, the problem is different. Cheap materials hide their environmental costs, but thousands of criminal loans are facing their children. That's where fungi come up. Biosync reduces them to recycle construction and demolition rates, turning Cleveland's life into healthy home. Isn't Biosync outdated? Legion has the blueprint. We just need to build it together.
Okay, so that video ran through pretty quickly, but there was the demolish. Sorry. Okay, demolish, grind, process, grow, build, live was basically the process there. So we're taking this construction and demolition waste. Much of it has organic material in it, including wood and asphalt shingles and different materials like that. it gets ground up into a powder and becomes the substrate for growing mycelium. It also can include a lot of the inorganics that are in the built environment, and that gets kind of bound together within that material in a way that is sort of like how cement holds together aggregate and concrete. So it's woven together in there, it's encapsulated in it. It's not necessarily food for the fungi, but what it is kind of woven together and glued together there. And I'll talk about, how this works, but there's a lot of the fungal metabolism is able to remediate as it recycles. But firstly, we're just going to define the process. It's BioCircular uses living organisms to recycle and remediate demolition waste into new healthy materials. And we believe the process will be used to not only recycle houses, but entire cities one day. And imagine that disaster relief scenario where I was talking about, lots of debris from homes, but also lots of debris from, the trees that are fallen. And the disaster relief work is firstly clearing that debris and getting it out of the way. Imagine if there's armies of folks putting that into these big Dr. Seuss machines that are then recycling that into new houses. And, you see the meat grinder thing there, which is kind of aspirational, of course, turning Palladian villas from the waste material. But the whole idea is there where we're basically taking this waste resource, using fungi to not only recycle, but to remediate as we're doing it. And we're getting, some attention for this. It's just been in the BBC and Guardian newspaper, both in the UK, very interested in those areas, but a lot of the design magazines too are kind of taking up and noting, because architects know this is a huge problem. Anybody that's ever been on a job site sees the dumpsters and they see the material going out of there, and it kind of, breaks our hearts as architects to see that happen. There's a few ways that this works. So, obviously fungi metabolize. So as they do so, they secrete enzymes that break down the substrates in their environments, and then through osmosis absorb that into their own biomass. As they do that, they're creating these fungal networks of hyphae that are holding things together, their substrate, and creating composite materials. And then the way the remediation works is twofold. There's an enzymatic action that happens when the fungi are secreting these enzymes. They can break down petrochemicals in the built environment, even things like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, breaking them down into smaller molecule chains that are then safe for the built environment, or safe to be in the environment at all. And then the things with the heavy metals is that they're elemental toxins, so you can't break them down. What you have to do with those is filter out as much as possible, but the material that's left can become bioabsorbed or biochelated in such a way that they become biologically inert, so that if God forbid a child were to ingest something, that it would just pass through their body instead of getting lodged in their blood and their bones. But that's also true for not only the child, but the insect that then could go up the food web and kind of have this heavy metal continue on there. So again, importantly, it's very important to understand that the main thing we want to do is filter that out. But if there are parts per million in the low numbers, or ideally parts per billion of these metals that are still left behind, they become chelated in such a way that they're biologically inert. The way that we're, kind of proposing this, as you saw the project in Namibia, here in the United States, we're looking at more of a eco-luxury type application to this. We do believe that we can get back to, low-income housing and humanitarian projects like we did in Namibia, but some of those words are kind of bad words now, and the type of investment that we're finding is probably the most advantageous for moving this forward, is to have the environmental justice side on the remediation part, and then have more of this eco-luxury type of application for the architecture, starting with things like backyard units, including small live-work offices or gyms, up to the bedroom suite you see there, through accessory dwelling units, and then all the way up to full-scale architecture. And so, there's a couple markets that we're looking at here. Again, the demolition waste, that's up to 15 billion or so just now, and until we really prove that this is a model. It could actually quadruple or even tenfold that when we look at the 30 million homes in America. that have dangerous levels of lead-based paint. If we, prove that there's a method for actually recycling that, we believe that we can work with others to create a mandate for making sure that no child is poisoned by their environment anymore. And then, of course, starting with the environmental consumers to have an eco-premium prefabricated homes. That's roughly a $5 billion industry at this point, but always rising. We've developed, as I mentioned, a few different target markets, looking at folks that might need that accessory dwelling unit or eco luxury type of application. Starting with something that has no plumbing that you see there at the top left, very, very easy to build. But is doing this environmental justice thing, and we have this avatar, Chad, who's in a work from home, Austin environmental justice lawyer. He's got some money to burn, and he wants to put his money where his mouth is, and shows clients that he does care about environmental justice. He's an architectural aficionado, and he thinks that looks pretty sweet, so he wants one of those. And then you have, potentially eco tourism types of applications where they're, probably more interested in the food and materials thing that we were talking about, but maybe they do care about the environmental justice aspect, and they want to get into something that creates environmental justice in Cleveland, and then takes it to Sedona and says, guess what we did? And then, moving up the scale to accessory dwelling units, short-term rentals, and then all the way to, potentially full-scale housing, prefabricated housing that is easy to ship, built in Rust Belt cities like Cleveland, and can go all the way to, higher end markets like Portland and Seattle and things like that. So that's kind of the business model we're developing. It's not, the reason we're doing this, I kind of hate business models and doing all that, but it's not enough to save the world. You have to prove that you can make a lot of money for somebody that's going to invest in you to do it. So that's why we're looking at these different things, and we're developing these concepts. But the, first thing we're doing is going from those bricks that you see there into these slabs. Starting on the top left or the bottom left, and then moving on to build bigger and bigger structures as we move along, and we're kind of bootstrapping this as we go along until we find that angel investor that wants to say, okay, let's just start with that facility that's going to make that prefab structure, or build me one of those, and that's going to be our demonstration on how these materials work. And so if this sounded like a pitch, it's because it is. This is kind of embedded within there. I'm actually pitching next week for this. And so in that room, I'm going to ask them for the first 10K that's going to get us to the next 200K that gets us to the 5 million that we need to do this bigger project. So that first 10K is going to pay for all of these material testing things. We've done that, of course, in the past for MycoHab. We've done it before for our work for NASA that I'll show you soon. But to do it for the biocycler is something that we need to, kind of invest in and move forward. Add that to our, a little bit more money that gets to the panel, that takes the brick to the bigger thing that can then make this more affordable to build with. And then, of course, our first unit is the next thing after that. And so I'm going to talk about the remediation part of that a little bit more as we go further into this. And so many of you are probably familiar with bioremediation. I actually saw some books over here that talk about mycoremediation. So kind of skip down, phytoremediation is plants, microbial remediation is bacteria, and mycoremediation is probably the favorite of this room. It's a favorite of me, and it's the use of fungi to remediate. And so, firstly, we were looking with biocycler construction and demolition waste, taking these biobinders, making the new materials, and remediation at the same time. As time went on, we found a lot of different waste streams, people coming to us and saying, hey, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? We had Goodwill come to us and say, we're throwing away tons and tons and tons of, material. People give us their holy socks, and we're not going to sell those. And so, they end up going to landfill, unfortunately. We looked at biocycling them, and they're actually making very robust materials. And we're looking at the ability to break down the dyes that are in the fashion industry that would not only be useful for making the waste material that comes out of fashion more sustainable, but the manufacturing, because a lot of those dyes just go straight into the river from manufacturing. If we found, the fungi was actually advantageous for breaking down those dyes, there could be, again, a mandate for making sure that that happens. Agriculture, that's an easy one. Biomass from invasive species, a huge one. But the soil remediation was one that wasn't really on my radar as an architect. My wife's a landscape architect, so and I live on Earth, so I do care about soil. But it wasn't on my radar because I wasn't really building with it necessarily with dirty soil anyway. But it's been brought to my attention, and we've started working with some folks, and we're looking at actually remediating soil using fungi, and we've done a experiment that I'll talk about here that it actually is kind of a little bit breakthrough, and we're turning this into something a little bit bigger now. But what we did is we started with sampling sites in Cleveland. We took samples from 30 properties. 20 out of the 30 of them were above the lead safe threshold, way above. It had an average of 1,700 parts per million, with the average or the safe level being some say 300, but it's probably more like 200. But we used 300 for this paper, and the worst being actually 20 times that, so about 6,000 parts per million. That is more than the baseline in Cleveland. I don't want you to think that every site in Cleveland is that bad, but it's generally due to these acute toxins that are near crumbling infrastructure. So if there's lead-based paint chipping off the building, getting into the soil, that's where you're going to find these concentrations that are like off the charts like this. 20 out of 30, that's a pretty bad hit rate for what we were noticing there, but it's kind of indicative. So we're doing more testing. We're going to see, was this an outlier, but a really bad start to that. But what we were looking at, once we gathered that, was to mix that material together and test different biofilters, and that's why it's pertinent for the talk tonight. We looked at different species of fungi, starting with just the spent mushroom substrate. So that's a waste material from cultivation. That's what we throw away after we grow our mushrooms. And wanted to compare that to the baseline, which is powdered activated carbon, and that's what's in your Brita filters. That's what most water districts use to filter the water that we drink. And the key takeaways that we found. Well, let me describe exactly how we tested that. So we basically mimicked hydrology. We had water filtered through the soil, then it went through a biofilter, and then we captured the water and we tested all three. So, how much lead was still left in the soil, starting for that 1,700 parts per million, how much got into the biofilters, and how much got into the water. The first experiment showed that there was very little mobility. It's hard to get the lead out of the soil using normal hydrology. So we did another test where we actually increased the acidity of the material, which actually increased the mobility by about 25 times. So, the first big takeaway from the experiment was that, by just changing the pH of the soil a little bit, we get a lot more mobility of that heavy metal. And then the next test was the efficacy of the different materials. So we tested them using X-ray fluorescence at Ohio Northern University, and that's my daughter Layla at Ohio Northern, testing the water there using microwave plasma atomic emission spectroscopy. And I made sure she knew how to say that at the end of this because she put it into her own science experiment. And, I think she got an A for it, so it worked out for her, and she actually won some awards at one of the science fairs. So hers was experiment was mostly looking at the mobility of that, and then the biofilter was just kind of an additive to her science experiment. And again, the mobility of the soil was the one that was the biggest breakthrough, where 25 times the mobility of the lead coming from the soil just by decreasing the pH by a little bit, to safe levels that of vinegar, not anything that's going to burn your skin, of course. And then our last run of this actually showed that the biofilters perform twice as good as the powdered activated carbon. So the first ones we did with just a spent mushroom substrate was basically neck and neck. But the most recent ones we did that prioritized using pure mycelium rather than the spent mushroom substrate. The Pleurotus species actually was twice as good as powdered activated carbon for this very short experiment. So hugely, very good finding. We're going to continue to do this research, and then you'll see in a couple slides how we're looking to do this at a site level, at a demonstration level rather than just a laboratory. Another test that we did with folks at Case Western Reserve looked at, having that mycelium in a slurry that was in the aqueous slurry. In that one, we were able to remove 90% of the lead in just 5 days. So, we kind of brushed over phytoremediation. There was a lot of studies by the EPA in the early 2000s where they funded them, but they kind of stopped funding them because it takes years and years and years for phytoremediation work, and you get percentages of usually less than 10%, kind of in the 3 to 5%. So going from 3 to 5% taking years to do to something that's 90% within 5 days is a huge swing, and that's by changing from different species using this is more of a active approach than the passive approach that we were just looking at, but worth more research and worth more study and more finding ways to actually demonstrate this that's useful. It's not just in the lab, but something that can be demonstrated in real life. And so the way that it captures it, so I'm just going to show some TEM, transmission electron microscopy here. So this is really, really zoomed in. You can see those bars down there. We're basically talking about, we're looking at the particle level there. So what you're seeing there is the cell wall of the mycelium on the left, and then you basically can't even see the wall because it's so big on the right there, but you can see how there's different hyphae there, and those little black dots you see there are the lead particles. So these are very, very small particles of lead, and they're lodged within that cell wall there. What's going on here is a process called bioabsorption, and those lead particles are going, firstly getting attracted to the outside of the cell wall of the mycelium by cation attractions. That is pulling it through that first layer. That's the manoprotein that you see there. It's just very permeable, going through the beta-glucan layer there, which is a little less permeable, but more like a screen. And then it gets lodged in this, that last layer there, which is mostly chitin-rich material there, and it doesn't make it all the way into the mycelium, so that the fungus is protecting itself by not having that go into the actual nutrient pathway, but it's getting lodged in that cell wall, and that's creating this polymeric encapsulation to it. So this is bioabsorption, basically pulling it in and locking it away. So this is when I mentioned earlier, there's this process where we're biochelating or bioabsorbing the material so that it would become indigestible or basically biologically inert. This is what we're talking about. And with mushrooms, you have to cook them so that you can break down that chitin, but so that it becomes digestible. Similar process here. This is a material that is very robust, and the children that may eat this in the future wouldn't be cooking this obviously before that becomes available to them. So this is this looks pretty scientific. I'm an architect. What am I doing here? The reason we're doing this is so I can get to this point here where we're doing our architectural projects, or in this case a landscape architectural project where we want to demonstrate this at a wide scale. We do this in a laboratory, and now we're kind of scaling this up. Same with MycoHab. We made these small bricks, and we say, hey, why don't we look at and see what we can do with 12 tons of bush, turn that into 3 tons of food for people in a house. Here we're saying, okay, we did this really small experiment in the laboratory, very advantageous scientifically, and we think there's a lot here we can do here. Let's put it at the site level, and let's have this the results from this experiment very public facing. And there you see the information chart there, which we want to make into something that's real-time censoring of the remediation that's telling us what is the lead mobility in the soil, what is the biofilter capture, and how much of that is going through the water that we then need to clean a little bit more. So long walk basically to get us to the landscape project, but that's kind of wrapping up the biocycler concept. If you'll come with me a little bit further, I'm going to take you off planet, and we're going to, yes, I'll take a question.
When you filter out and it captures all the carbon and then it's all left at the bottom of your structure there, what do you do with that?
When you say where we're capturing the lead? Yes, so we're capturing those in these biofilters, and now we have a very concentrated version of that lead, which can be disposed of safely, rather than that lead being dispersed in the yard that the child is playing in. So, it's basically a small filter material. So the idea here is to basically mobilize, capture, and dispose of that. So. Well, a lot of times with phytoremediation, what they do is like kind of an incineration that actually burns that, and you capture the smoke and you capture everything, and then you have a small thing. With these biofilters, they basically could be disposed of without doing that incineration, unless you were to scale this up to, kind of plant-sized process where you'd have, tons of these filters that were going there. But yeah, with the science experiment we're doing now, it's kind of just safely disposed of in the type of thing you would dispose of any kind of lead material. Yeah. Okay, so we're going off planet here. This is a project we're doing NASA through a program called NASA Innovative Advanced Concepts. It's the NIAC program, and the principal investigator for this is Dr. Lynn Rothschild at NASA Ames. We've been working on this since 2017, and we've gone through 3 phases of the NIAC program. It's only the 8th time they've ever awarded a phase 3 to this. They're very keen on this because what we basically pitched to them was that by being able to grow buildings off planet, grow the building materials off planet, that saves potentially trillions of dollars in mass transport, because you don't have to take heavy materials to destination to be able to build. Lunar bases are very forthcoming, and then we're in the next decades, I would say we're looking at potentially having a base on Mars that could house human beings. These are going to be explorers. Certainly the trips to Mars are not going to be for fun and recreation. This is about basically evolving life beyond planet Earth. So it's very big picture. Looking at what we're doing here, and we believe that to do this, it's going to take an all-kingdom approach to do it. So we think we need to go with all of the life that basically turned planet Earth from a barren rock 3 billion years ago to what it is today. There was no oxygen on Earth. There were the ability for us to habitate this planet did not exist 3 billion years ago. It's because of the evolution of life that broke down things in our environment that then released oxygen into the environment and created the ability for us to live. What we want to do is condense that down into a very living type of architecture that enables us to explore beyond Earth with these species. The quick way of demonstrating this is an animation where you have this inflatable structure that has bioreactors embedded within it. It's met with a rover that supplies water and gases on Mars that enable autotrophs to grow inside those bioreactors that become the substrate for growing mycelium. And then you get a composite material inside of those bioreactors that are insulative, structural, and very importantly, are radiation resistant. So there's many things that the inflatables are. That they are actually very structural, because instead of having gravity loads coming down and weather pushing on your building, what you have here is a pressurized vessel where you have air inside of your building and air not outside of your building. So all of the forces are pushing your building outwards like a balloon. And these inflatable fabrics are much stronger than steel and titanium, and actually create that structural shell to it. But by filling that with a solid material, you're taking off some of those forces that they're pushing on those fabrics, and you're creating thermal mass, and you're creating thermal insulation, and you're very importantly creating radiation resistant material through the thickness of the material, which is not the case with the inflatables that are very thin. We've developed a lot of different archetypes for this. We're working with Dr. Jim Head at Brown University, who was one of the scientists for the Apollo missions. He and Commander Dave Scott, which is one of the 12 people to actually walk on the moon, has developed a design reference manual that utilizes this mycotexture. And so we're working with them to get this design reference manual out that will be part of lunar bases that are feed forward to Mars. And the reason they've set it at 500 days is because that's basically the round trip duration that you would want for going to Mars, and then getting into that window that gets you back in a very short amount of time. So the way that the planets cycle with each other, there are windows that you want to get into, and you're either going for like 30 days or you're going for 500 days. And Dave Scott has been to the moon and said, why would you go for 30 days? you gotta do the 500. So. And that's what NASA's tracking for right now. Is basically 500-day missions. We're doing another competition right now that looks at feeding people for those 500 days. It's called Mars to Table Challenge, and we're actually using this architecture that creates these autotrophic organisms, things like spirulina and chlorella as the food for the fungus, but also the food for the people. And then, of course, the fungi can create all kinds of different edible products that we can look at. But these are some of the archetypes we're developing for that. We're actually looked at orbital stations as well. Here, the option is not as much because we don't have the in situ resources of water and gases in orbit. So what one would do is they would actually use water that's brought from Earth to create a hydrogel that will allow the mycelium to grow. The mycelium creates these biochemicals, things like melanin, which are good for blocking radiation. And then that hydrogel would be lyophilized just using basically the vacuum of space to recapture all of that water, because it's a very precious resource. But then you would have an aerogel that has this melanin material in it that's able to block from radiation. So you get your thermal insulation from the aerogel, you get your radiation shielding, and you get your water back. Through the process. And this is kind of looking at one of those units that was inside of that I called a bioreactor, using these soft goods to become the reactors. They have heated membranes, they have light embedded with them to enable the autotrophs to grow, and they have these basically respiratory systems that allow air exchange to actually feed the fungus and enable the lyophilization. So from left to right, you see it filling with water, filling with mixing with the hydrogel. This is basically like MEAP, agar material that if you guys do Petri dishes, that's what we're talking about here. It enables the fungus to grow in there to create these biochemicals that are advantageous. And then once we freeze dry them, basically, you're left with that aerogel material. And so that's just one of the suites of materials that the micro aerogel. The first one you saw again was using a substrate that was an autotroph that was grown in the bioreactor. There's three main ones that we look at. So that's the aerogel is the one I was just talking about. The other one, the microbricks, is basically looking at those algal colonies that creates the substrate, and then we grow the mycelium in it. And then the last one is mycoregolith, which I'll talk about shortly here. But one of the things that's really fun for me as an architect is to look at this concept of materials made from architecture. And architects just love flipping things on their head, and normally you think of making materials and then using those materials to make your architecture. This is a way we get to kind of go the other way around and use the architecture to make the material. And here's close up of this concept of the regolith that we're looking at here. And regolith is just another word for dirt, because there's no organics on the moon or Mars. It's called regolith instead of soil. But basically, it's the consistency of sand, and it's an inorganic material, and so it needs to be mixed with some sort of organic material to allow the mycelium to grow. But we can do that by growing those autotrophs. Again, here we're using spirulina and mixing it with the water, which is an in situ resource that we have on both the moon and Mars. There's plenty of water to use for industrial purposes like this. And then, of course, the mycelium is the one thing that we have to bring from Earth. We bring a culture of the spirulina to be able to grow there, but that's something that's created in situ mostly. And then that mycelium is something that's prepackaged inside of our inflatable, but it only accounts for about 1% of the mass needed to make this material. So you can imagine a scenario where we're taking grams of material and turning that into literally tons or potentially thousands or millions of tons of material at destination, because it's able to grow from the water and the nutrients you find at destination. And on the right there, you see a little sample of that material. So fun thing for us to do is to embed these algal reactors, these different types of reactors, into our architecture and make it so that they kind of flow through there. There's a lot of reasons for doing that. I'll show you, kind of some examples. from a professor in South Carolina, Kyuhee Kim, who creates these algal facades that, she does these to show that you can create, biomass and food and create oxygen from your architecture. But here, if we take that to Mars, we can take that even further and use that as the constituents for making materials for feeding people to scrub CO2, and uses the life support system and everything else. That's Dr. Lynn there, Dr. Lynn Rothschild, using one of our very beta algal reactors that are made from these soft goods. And then on the right is a sample of the material in there. So I'll just show a little bit of the architecture and the kind of the urban design concept here. So we have these little modules. We're calling them ARC, as in Noah's Ark. We're taking all of life here to grow our things. And so it's ARC module 1 forming into this toroidal shape, which is our ARC array. And then once they're connected, we have this outer layer that kind of encapsulates that and creates a greenhouse that goes along there that needs less pressure to grow the plants within them, because our space travelers can go into them with suits on, but having that extra shell there with less pressure actually relieves the pressure on our ARC modules, because to be in it's basically like a balloon inside of a balloon, and if you step down the pressure for each one of them, then the materials get a lot less tension on them. And so it's kind of what they look like architectonically. We have this multi-layered facade there. We have the algal reactors embedded into the fenestration, and then here's kind of a image of what that toroidal shape would look like on Mars, growing again, producing all of the kingdoms. Here's a image going through one of the hallways that we're talking about there. Again, they're wearing these lightweight suits there because there's a little bit of pressure there, enough to have the plants grow, but not enough oxygen for them to breathe. And again, this is an outer layer that holds these reactors and holds the ability to grow plants that are compartmentalized from our space explorers, so we don't want cross-contamination in that way. Another huge benefit of actually, having these algal reactors or the water systems that are part of the facade here, you can see that, by having that water layer, it's actually a great radiation shield, because water has a lot of hydrogen bonds, and they're called low-Z materials, which protect from the type of particle radiation you get from solar wind. We don't experience that here on Earth because we have a nice atmosphere, and we have a magnetic shield that goes around the planet. That's not the case on the Moon or Mars. So the type of radiation you get there, not only things like UV and X-ray and gamma that you have to worry about, which are electromagnetic radiation, but there's particle radiation because the sun is just spewing out these particles that are cause cancer to you or I. But is protected by this water layer. You get also thermal management, the same way that we have sweat glands that enable us to have evaporative transportation, or the blood in our bodies that move not only oxygen to all of our cells, but mitigate our thermal regulation and keeps areas of our bodies warm and cools off other parts. You have the life support system. You have the ability for this to be transparent because it's water, for fenestration, and the huge benefit is on Mars especially. There's nitrogen and there's carbon dioxide in the air. So when we do this on the Moon, where there's no atmosphere at all, we would have to pack those things, but this would be feed forward again to Mars, where we have the ability of, again, using all of these different kingdoms of life for creating the building blocks that enable us to live. We would have these nitrogen-fixing organisms called diazotrophs that can take nitrogen out of the air and then put them into the building blocks that not only we need to eat, but plants need to eat. So we don't have to take nitrogen fertilizer. We don't have to do Bosch-Haber types of methodologies to create ammonium. That was a huge thing that we had to do on planet Earth to feed all of the people. Was to devise that method, and that only happened in the 20th century. If there would be half the population now if that wasn't made. But that's a very expensive and heavy industrial process. We won't have that on the Moon or Mars for a very long time. So having these living organisms that can do that can fix nitrogen, can fix carbon dioxide, and create all the constituent parts for us to live. Enables the animals that you see there, that are space traveler, to do the things like exploration, scientific research, and I argue that all of these kingdoms together, take what we first described as that first 3 billion years of evolution that turned Earth from a rock into a habitable ecosystem where all animals exist, and then package that up and enable all of that life to go beyond this planet and potentially see them and create new worlds that can have all of this life and create new ecosystems. So that's I'll kind of leave that there, like the philosophical bent to our concept for the NASA work, and then kind of tie back these 3 projects together. Mycohab, which was taking this invasive this encroaching species of bush, turning it into food and material, so a waste product going into these beneficial things, also regenerating land and storing carbon dioxide. Biocycler, which looks at taking the blights in cities, thinning cities like Cleveland, and then converting them into not only new architecture that's carbon storing, but remediative services that potentially can save children's lives, or at least prevent developmental delays. And then, of course, BioArc is a little bit harder to understand the waste resource that goes into that, but I mentioned the radiation environment that we're talking about there. So that's very ubiquitous outside of the Earth's magnetic shield. We have this high energy radiation, and fungi are actually able to transduce that into new forms of energy, into biomass, and create a valuable material. So here, just like in the woods where we see fungus, turning dead matter into delicious mushrooms that I'm sure we have some in the back there. We see fungi converting all of these different waste materials into useful materials and regenerating as they do so. So that's kind of where we're going to leave it tonight, and hope we have some questions to talk about. Thank you. And my email's up there, so everyone can see, and please do reach out. Find us on Instagram, of course, too, and like and share. Yes, ma'am.
How long do your, I guess, microhab bricks last right now? What's the lifespan of this type?
Yeah, so the question is, how long is the lifespan of the building materials? And so we would say indefinitely if they're protected. So very similar to wood construction. I mentioned the pyramids in Egypt. They're the great the pyramid of Dasher is one where they found these wood timbers that were used as shoring to hold up the blocks there, but they're still there 5,000 years later, and it's because they're protected from the environment. There's trusses in Europe that are hundreds of years old. As long as there isn't a wet and dry cycle breaking them down the same way that we would break down wood, they will last forever because it's basically a woody material, and it has the dead fungal organism in it as the glue. So the woody materials, lignin and cellulose, or lignocellulose, and that's what dead wood is. What's left over from our fungal materials when they're baked is basically chitin, and that's another thing that doesn't break down unless there's something attacking it, or including microbes or vermin. So similarly to wood, these materials should last forever as long as you protect them from the environment, and that's done through architectural detailing. But if you want to have them biodegrade, they will, and I think that's a huge benefit, because we see materials going into landfills that aren't breaking down, or they're mixed with toxins, and they do break down, and then you're just left with those toxins, and you can't recycle them. These are materials that could be composted at the end of the day, and so the proper detailing, the proper end of life cycle to these materials, I think that's what helps make them regenerative. We got to follow up.
Do you have a system in place where you could actually make those bricks here in the US right now?
Yes, so we're making, the question was, do we have a system in place where we can make the bricks in the US? And so yes, we're making them in Cleveland. I mentioned 20 interns that are coming this summer. They're all going to be making bricks. They're going to learn to cultivate mushrooms. They're going to harvest those mushrooms. They're going to take the mushrooms and they're going to make materials out of them. The biocycling is something that is a little bit more at a laboratory scale where, because we're testing the remediation as we're doing this. Even those interns are going to work on some of those remediation studies. We're publishing papers on that. So we're making bricks. That's easy to do, and I do that every day. What we want to make are the slabs, and so that's what we're trying to get into place, and that's where, when I asked you for $10,000, that's what I was going to do with it. We have, access to presses that are much bigger than the ones I have, up to 800 tons. We can use them, but we pay for their use. The molds to make them are kind of expensive, and so to scale this up, we're bootstrapping it. 10,000 isn't a lot to ask to kind of get to that next step. But to get to those slabs, we kind of have to scale up our operations so that we're not just making those bricks, because even with 20 interns, it's going to take me all summer to make enough to do a wall. If we were doing these slabs of materials, we would be making the wall in minutes instead of months. So yes, we can make the bricks. No, we can't make the slabs yet. Yes, we will make the slabs soon with your help. Yes, sir.
Well, I guess that leads to my question.
Yeah.
When do you anticipate actually having these things available or or?
Okay, so yeah, the unit you saw there, ideally, we would have the first one built in my backyard next year. So, what we're looking at doing is making those slabs, building the demonstration site, proving that, like we did in Namibia, it's the world's first structural mycelium building was in Namibia. This will be North America's first, and it'll be done in a way that we believe is going to be a little bit more marketable. And so, yeah, that's what we're looking to do next year. And then after that demonstration happens, that's when, we believe we can open that up and, you can have one for yourself. We're starting the wait list. I think there's a sign-up sheet over there. Yes.
Just curious with the time cycle between growing mushrooms and brick.
Okay, yeah, very similar to what we said in Namibia is 30 plus 1 days, right? That was for oysters, so it's going to be a little bit different because we're doing reishi species, Ganoderma. In the States as we do that, so it's a little bit more like 60 plus 1 days. So we're going to get our first fruiting cycle in 60 days. We're going to harvest those, and then we're going to send those out. So that's for the pharmaceuticals plus materials kind of concept. With a biocycler, it will take less time because we're not looking to fruit anything there. So that could be a little bit more along the lines of even 15 or 30 days plus 1 day. So again, the agricultural process, as quick as any agricultural process is, and then the very next day we have our building material. So it's advantageous for both our farmer and our manufacturer.
And actually, that's the second question that we were talking about protection from vermin. Is this something that we have issue with?
Yeah, so same way, similar to wood, we do have to protect from vermin, and so we just detail them the exact same way that you would detail wood. Sorry, architecturally detail. So we have it. The 2x4s in your wall are kind of encapsulated in between things, or potentially if when wood is exposed, sometimes there's a coating to it, that type of thing. Just getting wood off the ground a little bit is a way to detail it. So in Africa, the major detail was if you put wood directly on the ground, the termites would come up and eat the whole house within days. If you put it up 2 inches, they never get there. So it's the concrete, just having that 2 inches, they just don't even think to go look there. I suppose somebody could like grab them and put them in your building if they hated you, but yeah, for some reason that's worked for hundreds of years in Africa, and that's kind of the detailing that we do there. Yes. So it's very similar to solid wood. So yeah, we're looking at making a wall section that was as thick as Mycohab. It was about an R19 that you would get from that solid wall, which is code for Cleveland, Ohio. It's probably, I don't know what it is here, but yeah, 17. Yeah, so even Alaska is like R19. We tend to go beyond that. If you're doing something like passive house, you're looking at like R40 or something crazy. But anywhere, R23 is probably a good sweet spot. So if you get your structure is actually at R19, and then you add some insulation to that, it's real easy to get that R23. Rock wall is a good way to do that. Yep, absolutely. Yes. Rated for earthquakes? Yeah, so the materials, basically the way we do it is, we'll have the materials and we'll show the modulus of elasticity, and then the engineer will design it basically with those things in mind to make it, seismically. So a good way to do this with this type of material is just to have a big shear wall. And so when there's lateral forces that happen that way, they go diagonally through that. And so just by having a wall that's thick enough in every plane of your building, so it's really about how you lay out the building to make that work. But yes, it would be just as effective as solid wood, like cross laminated timber is a methodology for creating those resisting lateral forces, but you do it with the very thick walls in the right directions. Yep. Sorry. Oh, yeah. So the question was, would just this bush work, or would lots of different substrates work? Anything you can grow fungus on works, and even stuff that you can't, as long as you mix it with stuff that you can. And that's what we found with this, mycorrhizal example we showed. So that's using, think of that as sand. The fungus isn't growing on that sand, but there's enough stuff around it that the fungus is growing into and weaving it together and holding it like cement holds concrete. That when you compact that together, you get a really dense composite. So yeah, loads and loads of invasive species throughout the planet. If you take agricultural waste, things like straw from farming grain, you take bagasse from growing sugarcane, that all adds up to billions of tons of biomass that goes to waste every year. And a lot of times the bagasse is just burned in the field because they can't get rid of the biomass. They just literally burn it. But it could go into creating mushrooms, feeding people, and then taking that byproduct to house people. Yes. Yeah. So yeah, the question was, do we want to manufacture this and sell this, or is it in support of our design projects? And I want to say it's probably somewhere in between. What we want to do is probably the latter, where we're building projects and we're demonstrating them, and then the big captains of industry come in and say, I have a plant that does 1 million square feet of material every month. I want to, I want to do that, demonstrate it for them, and then they're the ones that are going to, save the planet because they're doing the types of scales where we're talking about offsetting carbon and actually almost turning the dial backwards on emissions. You can imagine a scenario if they're replacing even a small percentage of concrete that's being produced. You mitigate a lot of greenhouse gases. I don't want to be a manufacturer. I'm an architect and I want to build stuff. So we're looking at getting into prefabricated houses where we could build those and sell those. Um, as kind of a model for others. And it's kind of like, yes, go ahead and steal our technology because we want everyone to do it. We feel like, we can make a good enough living just kind of doing these small demonstrations and hopefully inspiring others to take it big time. Ideally. Yeah. Um, so yeah, in regards to intellectual property, the project we did in Namibia, we filed for patents for, and that was, MIT owns that intellectual property. So they would have to kind of work that out with them, which would be, they have better lawyers than I do, so good for them. But yeah, I think there is a way that the technology does get dispersed, and it'd be my ideal that it's open source, but I'm not going to be able to control what MIT does with it. Yes. Hmm. Yes. Yes, absolutely. So yeah, the question was, we were just concentrating on lead for this talk here. Lead is, near and dear to me. In Cleveland, we have 4 times the incidence of lead poisoning, and it's because of our crumbling infrastructure, the built environment. I think it's a, very worthwhile thing to go after, but this is just showing that any heavy metal can really be done that way. They all tend to have this positively charged attraction to the cell wall, which is negatively charged. So you can include in things like cadmium and different heavy metals that go into that, munitions and things like that. There's a lot of research on radioisotopes that are remediated through this. I know people are working on PFAS and all kinds of other things like that. I mentioned we're already looking at the reactive dyes that are in clothing. So yeah, that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think lead is one that I think is the most um, ubiquitous and pervasive and disgusting. That is even in our built environment, and so it's so ubiquitous that it needs to be addressed. But all of these different toxins can be addressed, if not by fungi, by other organisms that have learned to adapt with those types of toxins in their environment. So, yeah. 10 more. One or two more? Anyone got a goodie? Yeah. Um, I guess a bit. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a huge buff of science fiction. So the question was, did I read a lot of science fiction? So yeah, not really. And space architecture would never have been on my radar if I hadn't met Lynn. I went to this NASA conference. It was on biomimicry, and I said, hey, it just came from Africa. I heard about this, these projects that guys like Phil and David Benjamin were doing that they are using fungi to make things. I think, I don't know why, we're not making food and materials at the same time from like these invasive species and, basically pitching this idea of growing a house. And, Lynn was there and she's like, I've always wanted to grow a house on Mars. And what did you think about working together? And so we, very next day we started writing this NIAC proposal, and within weeks we had it, and we've been working on it ever since. So yeah, so that's kind of what looped me into there. So I always say like my project in Africa took a detour to the moon because the next year I was presenting at the same conference saying, oh, look at this cool thing we're going to grow on the moon. Somebody said, why aren't you growing buildings on planet Earth? I was like, well, that was the idea originally. And so we teamed up. He was a researcher from MIT, worked at the Center for Bits and Atoms, and said, we're going to work together. I'm going to get you funded. And he did. And so from there, that's what became a Namibia. So it was kind of a detour that went there. And all of this is a huge detour to get me back to Cleveland to kind of save our children from lead. Okay, well, thanks again. I appreciate it.